Hi, happy to be here today. Wow, that was a really good talk and very expansive, and I learned a lot from it too. So I think it really talks to overall what's going on in the industry. I'm going to pull it back a little bit in terms of talking. Thankfully, I'm not going to try and follow up that talk on all the WebRTC technology in my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the enterprise space, and particularly around large enterprises, because it's a very dynamic environment, and talk about how we can come together as an industry with WebRTC application development, service providers, and people like ourselves, Alcatel Lucent, and put some very compelling services into the large enterprise, which has been a pretty closed environment for a long time. And we really see some significant changes going on based on work we're doing with these enterprises, and wanted to share that with you and talk about how there's opportunity for all of us in this new space. And the first thing is that people talk about the cloud, and the cloud is a very interesting thing and very dynamic. And you say, hey, I've got my PBX in the cloud, but it's actually still a PBX in terms of the application side of this. And so you've made great strides in terms of improving your hardware delivery and in terms of their deployment model, but in terms of how you integrate applications and create context and meaning and being able to move services around through the organization, that's still a very traditional model in delivery. And that's what we see as an opportunity to change, largely based on being able to embrace a web services delivery model inside of a large enterprise organization. So looking at the consumer side, looking at the business side of this, looking from the perspective of the enterprise, what's going on in their world that's changing and disrupting a model where the PBX and the environment that created the PBX has worked very well for them. I mean, it's been a very popular model. There's been a very successful structure around that. So what's changing in their world? And there's these four major elements that we see. One is consumerization. Really, I think we all talk about this in terms of BYOD and BYOA, but what's really interesting about the BYOD that we're hearing is that it's not in addition to, but instead of types of conversations. In other words, how do I use my employees' devices rather than using them in addition to the desk phone? How do I simply replace the desk phone? I don't want to buy that anymore. And that has some fundamental changes in terms of the economics of how the PBX marketplace works, and has a dynamic impact on that. From a departmental IT perspective, so the IT departments with cloud services have the ability now to go out and buy applications directly, and in some cases, people in this room and ourselves are marketing the applications directly to those people and selling them effectively. This is a good thing in terms of being able to meet the customer needs, but it also creates some challenges, which we'll talk about later. And then hybrid IT cloud. So from the perspective of the IT department who's managing or trying to manage this network and has been used to a model of command and control where they're able to tell the constituent lines of businesses and the IT departments the types of services and the types of technologies that they're going to be using, they're finding that they're having all these technologies pour into the infrastructure, and how are they going to manage that in a consistent, repeatable way with security, with controls, with regulatory in a lot of industries. These are very big challenges for these IT departments. And then I think we heard it before in terms of mobility, being able to make all of this available in a mobile environment. A lot of the applications now are being developed with mobile first, and then they figure out how to do the PC. So the comments that Vish made about thinking about WebRTC in the context of mobile are very, very important. You look at transactions that take place in the internet in the banking industry, that's moving very, very much to mobile. And so that we're finding the question on how do we support mobile better, and how do we manage our mobile service delivery in a broader way than we do today. I'm going to divert a little bit from the needs of the enterprise and start talking about how those needs in the enterprises are changing the ecosystem that's been delivering services to the enterprise for a long period of time. So the ecosystem that's been in place today with the system integrators, with the traditional PBX vendors and the IT communications vendors, has existed in a rich ecosystem of how the services were priced, and it was a very profitable business with a tremendous opportunity for those companies. And that model had been perfected and honed over the last 20 to 30 years and has been, really runs very, very large today. And so you look at it and you say, there's just no way that we can go up against that. But what's going on in terms of what the ability to consume services directly from the cloud and the disruption of the device marketplace, and you look at what's going on not just from a mobile device perspective, but also from a how services are consumed inside of the enterprise, from a PC perspective to an Android to an iPhone perspective, and the change that's happening inside of this ecosystem is very dramatic. And what's really dramatic about this is the price point of this. So we've seen this on the service provider side, and I've lived through it, and a lot of the service providers in the room have lived through it, and Ericsson's lived through it, and we've come out of, we're working through the other side on how to continue to make money and how to continue to provide communication services. The enterprise is in some ways just entering this phase of this discussion, and that's causing a big disruption in terms of how that ecosystem works. And when there's a big disruption in the ecosystem, there's an opportunity to take advantage of that for new players from an application perspective, from a network service perspective, all throughout the ecosystem. And I have two quotes here in terms of how some specific examples of how that's changing. So Cisco is moving very much into a full solution space as the margins around hardware go down. And then from an HP perspective, what Microsoft is doing on taking ownership of the end-to-end device side, and what Intel is doing in some of these things around servers, is causing them to question how they actually are going to market, and they're making these statements publicly. So this creates opportunity for new people in the marketplace. Going back to the slide about the first slide where the IT departments and all the different enterprise organizations are having the different relationships going on with them, or the different models of consumption, what they now have inside the enterprise is this model where you have different silos of service and delivery and application. And from a speed to market perspective, that's great. And there's really been some significant reasons behind why that's done, the need to meet specific business requirements. But at this stage, so many of these different applications have come in that have an end-to-end requirement around them in terms of how they interface to the front end and how they interface to the back end, that it's created a very big challenge in terms of managing this as a actual service inside of the organization. So what we've been having a lot of conversations with the enterprises about is looking for a model where that communications infrastructure is actually taken out of the context of individual applications, so out of an individual service and put into a common session management layer that's able to manage the transition from a legacy environment to this new API-driven environment. And this really represents more of a web service delivery model rather than a traditional network-based delivery model. What I want to talk about inside of that is some specific examples. So this is a abstraction of a real-world network in terms of the large enterprise that we've been talking with. And you can see all the different types of service models that they have to support. There's the business to employee, business to consumer, business to business services. There's internal, there's external, and there's multiple vendors across this. And you look at this in the context of, you have the audio, blink down for a second. They have audio conferencing, video conferencing, and collaboration, all of those coming from independent vendors, all of them with different logins, all of them with different service capabilities, and they'll work differently with different devices depending upon which vendor they work with. It gets to the point where the end user, forget about what the IT person has to do, but the end user ends up having to have a logbook of what type of deciding what device to use with what service and what the different procedures are for that. That's very complicated. And I think we've all been, as people inside the industry, confused by different technologies that have been introduced. And I've been in calls with people that have made the decisions about these products who have struggled to figure out how to use all of them. So you can imagine from an end user perspective in a large organization, the training or the complexity and the confusion around providing some of those services. From an implementation and a support perspective, the implications of that model become pretty dramatic. So when you're trying to create service deliveries that are able to deliver on context, meaning the ability to show how a person's activity moves through the organization as they're having an engagement with the organization in a B2C model, for example. Putting services on top of this infrastructure becomes very, very complicated. So if you look at, what is on your left-hand side, this is typically how we've integrated networks. We've integrated them on a product-by-product basis, interface, all these interfaces. And in order to do this, you have to lock down the releases on each of these individual platforms and come up with a common framework, put that into a lab, get all the vendors to agree to that. So when something breaks in that model, then you have to have pairwise discussions about who caused the problem, where it came from, and this can go on and on for months. From a system integrator perspective, you're looking at an 18-month engagement, which in some cases is great. But from a delivery of a service perspective, by the time you get to the end of it, and you've locked it all down, you have the service working on top of all this infrastructure, 5 of the 10 different products that make up the service offering have up releases maybe 1, maybe 2 times. It becomes very difficult to maintain this. And I think we all know this in terms of how we think about web services, and you look at how Google's able to push services to the new user in a very fast way, in an iterative way. They can, from a web services delivery model, you have the ability to push different service experiences to different people based on different analytics or based on different functions, all those types of things. That's where the enterprise wants to go with their network on the inside, being able to have API-based interfaces that are decoupled from this intermediation session control layer so that the devices and the applications are able to take advantage of the capabilities of communications without having to actually be really in the nuts and bolts of delivering that communication, because the complexity and the cost in order to achieve the service offering does not meet the objectives in that model. And this is where WebRTC really fits into this, is that it brings on the device side of this and brings on the ability to make this a browser-based experience end-to-end. And that's really a very powerful game changer, or the semiconductor in terms of the last presenter's comments on this, how that type of change that can really bring this market all the way into the real deployments. But it is a transition process, so we're not going to just jump from one to the other. And we've had the situation where we've jumped ahead a bit in some areas and put applications out there independently, and then we have this legacy environment. And what we're seeing an opportunity for is to create a platform that can migrate from one side to the other and provide the end experience now while still maintaining support for the legacy side. And here we see a significant amount of opportunity. So talking about the mobile-first enterprise. So if you put all the pieces together of mobility, enterprise identity, and an RTC communications platform that has the ability to manage your legacy environment as well as your API environment, then from an application perspective, you have the opportunity to bring context to a user experience associated with these services. And I'll give an example of this it was in a conversation that I'd had with a CEO of a mobile app developed banking application. So I had a conversation with him about how the application worked, and this application is used by several large banks as well as a large number of mid-tier banks. And it's a very rich and very useful application that's very, very nice in terms of allowing you to see your bank accounts, do transactions, and all that sort of thing. And I asked him the simple question, so when a person has been in the app and has a problem or has a question or has an issue, and they need to talk to the contact center, and in terms of the relevancy of the contact center, banking relies very heavily on human person-to-person communications. So the contact center is by no means dead, and talking to a real person when it comes to banking is by no means dead. And so he said, well, we just drop them back to the dialer in the phone, and they go into the call center tree. And I said, so let me see if I understand this. the person's been in your app for about 5 to 10 minutes. They either have a problem, they have a question, or they want to do something. And basically, you send them over to the call center, completely to start over. There's no context around what that person was doing. There's no understanding of how that person got to that point. There's nothing. It basically starts the whole process over again. And not only is that a bad experience for the end user, that's also a bad experience for the bank, because the bank has to put that person through 3 or 4 layers of problem solving to figure out what actually had occurred and which they already would have known if, in fact, you could have taken that session ID associated with that data session, placed a call into the contact center, and been able to, through a series of metadata and analytics associated with that person and presence capabilities inside the call center, provide that access from the person who had that problem inside their application directly into the right person to answer their question. The person who gets, the consumer is happier, the bank is happier because they've reduced their call center hold times, all their metrics have gotten better, and in fact, they could even potentially do better on their cross-selling and get better uplift out of the customer, because while they're there, it's like, hey, happen to notice this, those types of scenarios. This is powerful to the service providers and the developers. And I'll start first with the service providers, which is that these enterprises are looking for new ways to get relationships and get the enterprise identity both of their customers and of their internal employees into and out of the public domain. There's a real hunger for this, and I believe that there's money to be made from the service provider side on providing this service to these large enterprises. They are definitely willing to pay for this. And the way that we look at who's paying for the service is changing. There's no doubt of that. But the ability to find these types of capabilities to change the nature of the business to consumer value chain and cost structure and who's paying for what inside of that, be it the consumer or be it the enterprise, is definitely there. And sometimes there's questions about that in terms of will consumers accept that, but in a lot of cases they already have. In terms of how they accept ads for certain things, people vote with their wallet in a lot of cases, in most cases, and they've already accepted a lot of these services. So if in fact they get a coupon or some sort of benefit, value-added benefit pushed to them based on this type of relationship and this enhanced exchange of public and private identity around the interaction with that enterprise, that will be attractive to them. On the developer opportunity side, being able to take all of these services, like the banking app that I mentioned, put them into a package and build a service that has meaning to the end user or has meaning to the business in terms of cost structure, in terms of improved immediacy of experience, all those things that could have measurable results, will be of great value. And understanding how to use WebRTC in that context is going to be incredibly powerful in terms of bringing this value to the market. And we're talking about WebRTC and all the great things that it can do, but I think an important thing to remember is that it's not there, and in terms of its ubiquity and some of the other challenges that were brought up earlier in terms of battery life and what have you. That doesn't mean that we don't set ourselves up from an industry and from a value proposition and a business model as though that is the end state, but we have to make money between now and when the IETF decides that we're ready for this technology. And the story on this is really, I have this quote in here from Reed Hastings on Netflix. It was astounding to me when I went looking for this quote, because I've heard this multiple times, but I didn't realize how old Netflix is. I mean, 1997, they've been around a really long time in terms of modern companies. And they had this vision of delivering videos over streaming a long time ago, but they recognized that the technology wasn't ready, so they figured out how to build their infrastructure and build their model in a way that would allow them to make money and then ultimately allow them to get to where they are today. And yes, they had that big hiccup in the middle, But some would argue that that just created a great buying opportunity that most of us didn't take advantage of on their stock, because if you look at where they are now, that was just an anomaly that allowed some people to do very, very well. But looking at the enterprise marketplace and in terms of what we can do from a disruption perspective and taking, this is a very, very big market. And I think we all recognize that, but putting it out in front of us in terms of just looking at these numbers, and this actually came from a Forrester report that was done on behalf of, in partnership with Cisco. But you look at voice still makes up a huge piece of this, and conferencing in the context of audio conferencing, you put that together and you have nearly half of the marketplace. There's a real rich amount of capability or value out there to be taken by taking these core services, contextualizing them, and making them available across a much broader delivery model than is available in the current structure. And this is what, there is a big hunger for this in the enterprise marketplace, and being able to do this in a really cost-effective way. The point I think that's also interesting on here is what we see from the video conferencing line at the top. I think that video conferencing as a standalone service, in our view, or in my view, I should say this is a editorial opinion rather than an Alcatel Lucent opinion, is that that's going to end up getting subsumed into the social collaboration and conferencing. I think that the video conferencing, collaboration, and conferencing buckets are going to merge. With the WebRTC in particular showing the opportunity of how to build all of these services together in a browser-based experience, they really don't become independent delivery models anymore. And there's going to be a significant amount of disruption in terms of how this type of service is delivered to the marketplace. So in closing, there's, really, this is the enterprise market in general represents a huge opportunity for disruption. WebRTC plays a big part in us reaching that end state and the architecture. There's significant interest and dynamic discussions around how WebRTC creates a framework and a model for how we get there. But in between getting there and where we are today, there's going to be some adjustments to the practicalities and realities of where some of the different browsers are in the market, as well as some of the limitations we currently have. But absolutely, as a principle and where we're headed, it represents how we can construct this new model for the enterprise. And in the context of the service providers really see an opportunity to have a dialogue with the enterprises, how a service provider community can provide new types of services based on this context, based on metadata, based on providing identity access for consumers, for the employees, into the public domain, and sharing that in an economic way that provides value to both parties. And finally, from a WebRTC developer perspective, looking at contextual applications, building services that have a delivery model associated, or not a delivery model, but a delivery with them of an application that is a business application for things like HR or for finance or for social communities, those types of services that have a broader value to the enterprise than being able to create a video call. And so that's my talk, so thank you very much.